There's a monumental franchise that's going to make waves over the next decade. With cinematic releases every couple of years, it's going to be impossible to escape the behemoth that is Avatar. Wait, what year is it? Yep, the initial craze of the 2009 film died out shortly after, and nothing seemed to happen with the IP. Over a decade on, its creators are back for another stab. They released The Way of Water in 2022, and are now gearing up to release 3 more sequels. But they aren't just stopping with films. This looks like the start of a huge multimedia push, including some pretty massive AAA games. So, let's talk about it. Let's talk about the franchise, how its creators want it to be the newest, biggest and best brand on everyone's lips, and what stopped it from getting to that point in the first place. Let's start with the game, because this is a gaming channel. It's called Frontiers of Pandora. It's a Ubisoft title, so obviously it's an open-world action-adventure game with crafting and collectibles. It's created by Massive Entertainment, who made The Division 1 and 2. They were also behind World in Conflict, if you're a bit older and know that one, and if you're as old as me, you might remember Ground Control. Anyway, Frontiers of Pandora will see you take control of a Na'vi orphan who's been taken under the wing of the Resource Development Administration, the RDA. In Avatar terms, they're these fellas, the colonizers, the bad guys. You wake up after 15 years of stasis, and from here, you raise hell and bring the noise to your former subjugating overlords. They're out to exploit the natural resources of the planet, and it's up to you to stop them by uniting the native Na'vi tribes and teaching them how to fight against someone who has a massive walking battle tank. I know. It sounds like the original film pretty much, but it is its own unique thing. It's connected to the movies, but it's also not. Films are over here, and this runs here, sort of parallel, close, but not touching. It seems like the perfect time to release something like this, given there's about a decade's worth of franchise films on the horizon. The only other time would have been when the first film came out. Actually, they did that. They made a whole multimedia push back in the day, but it didn't stick. So, I don't know, why not just do it again? The first big Avatar craze was centered around the first film in 2009. Seems a long time ago now, but believe it or not, this wasn't actually the start of the whole thing. James Cameron had it in the works for a while. He wrote an 80-page treatment in 1994. And before you look it up, yes, that was before Titanic. He was probably bored of editing True Lies, which would make a fun game, come to think of it.
You're fired.
The original plan was to get it into production for a 1999 release, but Cameron didn't think the technology was ready to achieve his vision. And he was right. Can you imagine what a pre-2000s Avatar would look like? Ugh, it'd be rough. Frosted tips everywhere. The ball started rolling again a decade later, when the world had caught up to Cameron's lofty plans. It was officially budgeted at just under $240 million, which is an insane amount, even greater than Titanic. But luckily they didn't end up spending that. No! In the end, Avatar cost almost double. But as we all know, that money was well spent, because the film was bloody massive. It used cutting-edge motion capture and filming techniques that allowed it to be released as a traditional film, a 3D film, and even in 4D. Though I'm still not 100% sure what the fourth D stands for. Avatar swept up during awards season. It got nominated for 9 Oscars and 8 BAFTAs. It won every single Saturn title it was nominated for. They even ran out of awards and had to create a new one just for Avatar, the Special Visionary Award. Critics were bowled over by the special effects and sheer scope of it all. There was one running theme throughout the reviews. The visual side. Whew, brilliant! The story side, however, writing, characters, plot, narrative direction, they were all pretty forgettable. Audiences didn't care about any of that though. They were there for the visuals, and they turned out in legion. It became the highest grossing film of all time. Yes, I know, not when adjusted for inflation. Just included that to stop one person fact-checking me. Don't worry, I didn't forget about Gone with the Wind.
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
But grossing billions and billions of dollars wasn't enough apparently. James Cameron had even bigger plans. Avatar wasn't supposed to be just this one-shot explosive film. It was to be a franchise, a multimedia tour de force, the next big sci-fi series, the next Star Wars. All sorts of other offerings came out around the time. Art books, theme park rides, comics, exhibitions, even a Cirque du Soleil touring production. It was also the reason 3D movies suddenly exploded. TV manufacturers were convinced everyone would want to settle onto their couches and experience the same thrill at home. PC manufacturers were hot to take on the trend, and there came a wave of 3D-ready monitors. But here's a question. Can you remember a single game that was advertised as being fully 3D, that you had to put on these stupid glasses to play? Thought of one? No. Let me just answer that for you, because it's handily on topic. Avatar, the 2009 game. We couldn't get any real one. This did kind of keep to the plan of the film. It was supposed to push technological boundaries and cause a stir for Cameron's movie. It was released before the motion picture, and development went hand in hand with the blockbuster's production. Ubisoft were given a blank check and key story details, and set out to create something that would tower as high as its silver screen counterpart. On paper, the game seems kinda cool. Players would pick a side at the start, choosing whether to play as the RDA or the Na'vi. So it's kinda like 2 games in 1. Each side had their own weapons, skills, and different gameplay mechanics. The story changed depending on what side you picked, as does the world. A particularly nasty plant might try and murder a passing RDA soldier, for instance, but it'll leave the local Na'vi well alone. It had an asymmetric multiplayer mode, branching story paths, a rich and populated world, character progression, and even a turn-based strategy mode, where you could wage a war of attrition across Pandora, taking territories and gaining bonuses for your character. But that's all on paper. The reality of this game was just a bit... Those branching narrative paths didn't matter when the story was boring. The rich world was great for a few hours, but then it all melded together into a wash of greens and slightly darker greens. The character progression was meaningless. The conquest mode was a neat idea, but entirely useless, because the game was just far too easy anyway. You could stumble your way through the whole thing without ever needing a single bonus from the side mode. Despite the limitless budget, the creators made a game that had a lot of features, but all of them were just as shallow as a puddle. But I'm skipping over the game's biggest crowning achievement. Like the film, it was 3D. Not like 3D graphics, but proper, true, put on these stupid glasses and it all comes to life 3D. And that would be a pretty cool novelty if it were as simple as that. But as I'm sure you can expect, it wasn't. See, films can't just become 3D. There's a lot of technology and cutting-edge hardware that goes into it. One of the key things is the film's frame rate. The vast majority of films you've seen are played at you in 24 frames a second. Yeah, I know, I see you there playing CS at 300 plus frames, thinking 24 frames is basically Stone Age. But that's how it is. 24 frames is the sweet spot for films, and it gives things this nice cinematic sheen. But that doesn't work for 3D. You need more frames. The simple thing would be to double it, 48 frames a second. But that comes with downsides. It makes things feel artificial, because our brains are just so used to seeing movies at that 24 frames per second sweet spot. Avatar, the film, did something clever. It had a variable frame rate. It was high when it needed to be high. It gave us the 3D experience, whilst also meaning that slower scenes don't feel fake. The increase in FPS is also required for games. See, we don't have that same brain trickery with frame rates in games, because they're always different. In 2009, most monitors were 60 Hz. They could display at a maximum of 60 frames a second. But this wasn't enough for Avatar the game. To work in 3D, it needed double that. If you wanted to experience this game as it was meant to be played, you'd need to invest in a new monitor and 3D kit to do so. Remember, this was 2009. A monitor of that caliber would set you back around 500 UK pounds. Not to mention the hardware required to double your frame rate and keep it constant, because frame rate dips and 3D just don't mix very well. It's one of the reasons 3D gaming never really took off. It's a huge financial barrier to play a game, let alone one that's just so... It would have nowhere near the impact of the film, and would settle into obscurity. But here we are, 15 years later, and Cameron and Ubisoft are taking another stab at it. And whilst the first film made a splash, their decade-long plan for Avatar may well make tidal waves. Before the first Avatar film, Cameron said he wanted to make sequels if it was popular, and that sequels, multiple. Well, it was, and he held true to his word. A year after the first movie was released, 2 more were announced. They then added on 2 more for a total of 5 Avatar movies. That's an enormous commitment, but as I'm sure you've worked out, that first sequel took quite a long time to happen. It was initially supposed to be released in 2014, but Cameron was set on a story that took place in the waters of Pandora. Just like the first film, the technology didn't exist for his vision, so he waited till it did. When that happened, the film happened. Eventually. Avatar 2: The Way of Water was pushed back several times and became one of the most expensive movie productions ever, dwarfing the first film's cost. But it was finally released in 2022. And it was a similar reception to the first film. Everyone was singing praises about the VFX and visual spectacle. But the story, characters, writing, still not great. But that didn't matter, because it made a ton of money. So it sounds like history repeating itself. There's another game to go with the film. Maybe Cirque du Soleil will do another touring production. But then the fast is over and we wait 10 more years for it to happen again. Right? Wrong. It seems everyone noticed how the hype died out after a lengthy delay, and Cameron and co. don't want to repeat. Avatar 3 was filmed at the same time as Avatar 2. A third of Avatar 4 has already been filmed to account for the child actors aging. Avatar 5 will most likely tie into the filming of Avatar 4. These are planned to come out every 2 years for the next decade or so, until they run out of films. But Cameron has said he already has plans for a 6th and 7th film, which is pretty nuts considering the man's pushing 70. Avatar will carry on forever. They missed their first shot, but they will be relentless at an ending with their second. There's a clear trajectory and strategy here to keep the franchise in the public consciousness longer and make Avatar not just an anomaly, but a cinematic powerhouse. But as we saw with the first film, I don't think its creators or distributors are content with just cinema. They want it all. Games, comics, novels, merchandise, theme park rides. Look at the other huge franchises like Star Wars. It's got all that, as well as TV shows, board games, conventions, and legions of fans. You literally can't go a day on the internet without seeing someone mentioning Star Wars or a meme of Anakin and Padme. It's always around. I don't think Cameron wants Avatar to be just a visual spectacle that pops up every few years. I think he wants to be the next sci-fi great, always constantly in the conversation and marketable in every conceivable way. But you can't just be the next Star Wars. Even with all the money in the world, which judging by box office numbers these guys have. George Lucas' franchise means a lot of things to a lot of people. It's steeped in rich world building, has tons of lore and backstory for those who want to dig into it. But outside of that, it's just fun. For kids, for adults, it's a spectacle. Avatar does have that going for it. It's a visual marvel above even Star Wars. But that's just one criteria. It has its weaknesses. First of all, the depth. Back in the day, the director planned to write a novel about all the story and history and important details about the planet of Pandora and the Na'vi people. He's got all this built up, but it just doesn't come across in the films. The first one essentially boils down to a story about colonizing. Great, use that as an allegory, spin off it, but that's where the series seems to plateau. It's just a franchise about colonization. There needs to be more. There's clearly this depth that Cameron envisions, but it's just not felt in the films. Any flair is hamstrung by predictable plots and forgettable writing. If you asked a stranger to quote a line from Star Wars, I'd say more times than not you'd get something back.
Hello there.
But if I did that with Avatar, I reckon you could ask 1,000 people and only maybe one person would get it. And that's only if James Cameron somehow wandered by. It just doesn't have that memorability, outside of the visuals, I guess. And that brings me on to another, if slightly unconventional reason, why the Avatar series wouldn't reach those heights. It isn't memeable. I know it sounds silly, but think about it. Go onto Reddit and you'll probably see some template or quote from Star Wars or Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings or Star Trek or Game of Thrones or any of these other massive franchises. This keeps them in the public consciousness. It makes you remember those scenes. When the movie plays, it makes audiences point and say, hey, this is from the meme. Look, Avatar doesn't have that, but they're trying. Around the promo circuit for Way of Water, their social media team were replying to people with hand-picked shots of characters, images that were ambiguous enough for people to take them as a template. They were making the franchise memeable, and in doing so, keeping the conversation alive. Then there's the new game, Frontiers of Pandora. Honestly, it looks pretty solid. No 3D glasses are expected. No weird game mode on the side. No gimmicks at all, in fact. Just a solid, pretty, expansive open world game. Ubisoft's bread and butter. You might say it's playing it safe, but really I think that's the correct play. They tried to be a bit wild with the 09 game, and it all just fell flat. Here, they're just doing what they do well, and it should be a much better look for the franchise. Although, there is one minor elephant in the room. The open world action-adventure franchise game. They're also doing it with Star Wars. Not only are Ubisoft pushing out a very similar strategy in two different franchises, they're both being made by the same development studio, Massive Entertainment. Making both these games at the same time, I've got a feeling they're going to suffer somewhat. But we'll have to wait and see on that one. I'd be happy to be proved wrong. So, are we looking at another attempt at making Avatar a cultural phenomenon? I think so, yeah. The first attempt in 09 was let down by some of the side avenues being poorly thought out, and any momentum petering out as eager fans awaited another film. Will this go on to be more successful? Will Avatar rise again as a franchise and sit among the sci-fi giants? You know, I'm not really convinced. I'm not doubting the films are incredibly impressive, and watching them in the cinema is an experience second to none. I just feel they don't have the heart. I watched the first two films, blown away by how it looked, but I didn't laugh, I didn't cry or care about the characters, I didn't wonder what's going on in the wider Avatar universe. Until now, I haven't really thought about the series at all. But over the next decade, it's going to be pretty impossible to avoid with all these sequels coming out. For it to succeed, it just has to be more. It's got the whole spectacle angle perfected. Now it just needs life. With the games, and with every other avenue they decide to pursue, Frontiers of Pandora looks like it could be solid. But if it just doesn't have the heart, it'll be Assassin's Creed in blue face paint and forgotten about like the first game. And all in all, I don't know if I even want another big sci-fi franchise. But then again, I don't think James Cameron really cares. He apparently decided way back in '94 that this is something we all need. So let's sit back for the next decade or so and welcome the age of Avatar, whether we like it or not.